Welcome to another 2022 Darwin College Lecture Series, where, as I'm sure many of you know by now, we're exploring the interdisciplinary and multifaceted nature of the topic of food. Over the last 5 weeks, again, some of you will have heard already, we've looked at the importance of food as a source of nutrition, we've looked at the evolution of the restaurant, and we've looked at the production of food from farms to supermarkets to tables to inside our stomachs in some cases. This week we step back in time, however, and we're inviting Melissa Calaresu to explain the cultural history and evolution of food in early modern Europe. Melissa is the Neil McKendrick Lecturer in History at Gonville and Caius College here at the University of Cambridge, where her research covers culture and the urban environment and the history of ideas in modern Italy. She's originally from Canada, completed her PhD here at the University of Cambridge, and was funded by a Commonwealth scholarship for that. Spanning a wide range of disciplines, her work has led, among other subjects, to investigating the cultural history of the Grand Tour, the history of ice and ice cream in 18th century Naples, and the selling of street luxuries in early modern Rome. She recently curated an amazing exhibition, Feast and Fast, The Art of Food in Europe, 1500 to 1800, here in Cambridge at the Fitzwilliam Museum. It was a multi-sensory exhibition featuring spectacular reconstructions of banquets, feasting tables, and a Georgian confectioner's workshop, as well as those of you who are Cambridge-based will have seen, I'm sure, a flamboyant 4-metre tall golden pineapple in the garden, in the front garden on the front lawn of the Fitzwilliam Museum. Melissa's currently writing a cultural history of the city of Naples through the household accounts of the Welsh artist Thomas Jones. So please join me in welcoming Melissa to deliver her Darwin College lecture on food and cultural history. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Master and Fellows of Darwin College for the invitation to speak in this very engaging and powerful series for food. So far, it's focused on contemporary issues which we all can relate to, issues such as climate change, overconsumption, animal welfare, and food poverty, all things that resonate with us. We all know that what we eat and how we eat have consequences for our society and for the globe, and for these reasons, food has meaning. Before I continue, I'd like to reveal my own food identity. I was born in Scotland entirely by chance, and I grew up in southwestern Ontario until I came to Cambridge in 1990 as a PhD student. My mother was from northern Saskatchewan, and my father was born in what is now Slovenia, once part of Italy. My grandparents were both born in North Dakota. They were of sort of Irish and Central European heritage. And my paternal grandparents were born in Sardinia and Piedmont. How my family history, with its regional nuances within wider national food histories, that is, small town prairies within Canada and Sardinia within Italy, relate to my food identity, but it's not entirely straightforward. Food traditions don't pass evenly to the next generation, and although the Canadian and Italian food traditions are both strong, they've come to me in different ways. Canadian food traditions reach me through books such as this copy of the Five Roses Cookbook, the longest-running recipe collection in Canada and first published in 1913 as a result of a contest to which women submitted their recipes to the Lake of the Woods Milling Company. It was my baking Bible as a child. You can see the wear and tear as evidence of its use, with splashes of food hardened and staining its pages. You can just make out my handwritten note in pencil for the recipe for standard drop cookies, which I made as a child. So it's 1.5 recipes, so clearly wanted a bit more than normal. Another book which was important to me as a young cook was Food That Really Schmecks, first published in 1967. The author, Edna Stabler, was born in what was known as Berlin, Ontario in 1906, but renamed Kitchener after the First World War, before the First World War. Stabler came from the Mennonite community just outside of the city in Waterloo County, and her recipes reflect the Central European origins of the original Anabaptist movement in Germany transposed to a North American context. The first cookery book, the Five Roses book, was a copy that my mother must have been given before moving to Saskatoon to nursing school. And the second book, Food That Really Schmecks, is a copy that I bought secondhand. You can actually see the inscription of the first owner and the price that I paid, since the copy that I used as a child was still at my mother's house. While the first cookery book is directly connected to my family's history, both are the result of collective family histories. Those women who submitted recipes in 1913 and were adapted over the years, and the women from Stabler's Mennonite community. As the subtitle reads, they are recipes as prepared by my Mennonite friend Bevy Martin, my mother, and other fine cooks. And both books have been integrated into what one could define as Canadian food traditions, a reflection of the results of immigration from around the world, but also adaptation to the harsh climate and limited growing season of Canada. There are no books to represent my food history from my father's side, in fact, none. But there was knowledge passed on from mother to son and from father to daughter, what cultural historians sometimes call embodied knowledge, the traces of which are rarely recorded in early modern cookery books, but remain in the hands and in the memories of cooks and their apprentices. Here's my Italian grandmother, Cesarina, in her kitchen in Milano, and some anonymous hands making gnocchi. Those aren't her hands. She spent a famished childhood eating a lot of chestnuts and foodstuffs made out of chestnut flour in Piedmont. And later, as the wife of an army officer, she traveled around northern Italy with her family, experiencing and maybe even incorporating other regional food traditions into her cooking repertoire. Her cooking was in part determined by my grandfather's food choices, which included having fresh snails brought from Sardinia occasionally. These traditions have been passed down through practice, hands, and also through the recounting of family stories, memories. It's worth noting that there are very few objects related to my family's entangled food history. A painted and gilded wood coffee grinder with a metal handle, which was owned by my Italian grandmother, some metal cake and muffin tins, which I used for baking as a child, a few cast iron pots, which I now use to make soups and stews, and some beautiful copper saucepans, which were never used by anyone. There they are in my mother's house. The survival of these objects, of course, depend on the value given to them by my family, and also their function. The value might be the beautiful sort of gilding in the coffee grinder, even if it hasn't been used for decades, my own memories embedded in the pots and pans of my childhood, and the presumed value, or the sheen at least, of those copper pots, which were displayed high up on a shelf outside of the kitchen. And of course, all of those cookbooks, some of which bear the marks of use, while others are only inscribed by strangers. This brief personal food history has meaning to me, but it would have to be contextualized into a broader history of gender, consumption, and the creation of national food identities in the 20th century in order to really explore further meanings within social and cultural contexts. However, it should give you some sense of the kinds of sources which we can use to construct a cultural history of food for earlier periods: images, books, food stains, pots, and inscriptions. Food identities in the early modern period were only partly determined by these family histories, and for the most part, the objects related to these histories have not survived. Food identities were also subject to broader social and cultural changes related to, example, religious prescriptions or food taboos. Food choices were also determined by what was available and what was affordable. I make the distinction between identity and choice because, as we shall see, food identities do not always determine food choices. We are not always what we eat, and the same applies to eaters in the past. For this Darwin lecture, I propose to go back in time to the early modern period in Europe from about 1500 to 1800, when food also had multiple meanings: religious, political, and social, as well as personal meanings. Like today, food had consequences for one's spiritual and one's bodily health. Critiques of overconsumption and excess were common, although they were most often framed as religious questions. Renaissance writers discussed eating right within a classical system of the four humors, in which food was understood as a form of medicine which balanced out your body. And at the very end of the period, some consumers were refusing to buy sugar because it was produced by enslaved people. The act of eating in history has never been entirely neutral or without meaning. The eating, and especially the display of food, was of course linked to power in the early modern period. Eating rare and expensive foodstuffs, or simply more of what others could not, emphasized not only the differences between rich and poor, but also between eating out of season and eating in season, between having access to the land or not. It's important to remember that many people in this period did not have access to enough to eat, or their basic nutritional needs were not met all year round. Today, what is termed food security is the focus of important research around the world by social scientists. However, the visual and material culture, which I'm about to explore, are mostly vestiges of elite eating practices, that is, those who could afford to eat an orange in January, or who had landed estate to supply their kitchens with game. One of my jobs as a cultural historian, then, is to uncover a fuller range of cultural practices and meanings related to food from across the social spectrum. Many of these themes, as the master said, were explored in interdisciplinary and multisensory exhibition, Feast and Fast, The Art of Food in Europe, 1500 to 1800, at the Fitzwilliam Museum. It ran from late November 2019 until a pandemic closed it in the middle of March 2020. And I do hope some members here tonight were able to see the pineapple in front of the exhibition, like in front of the museum. The exhibition had more than 60,000 visitors and involved a full public program of lectures, activities, late nights, outreach work, and the creation of 2 films. And there's more on the website, the Fitzwilliam website, if you want to see what we did. The legacy continues in this richly illustrated catalogue, which was edited with my co-curator, the wonderful Dr. Victoria Avery, Keeper of Applied Arts at the Fitz. Its legacy also lies in the cleaning and conservation of paintings in the Fitzwilliams collection by the university's Hamilton Carr Institute, such as this still life with a lobster from 1660, by Joris van Son. The exhibition was the result of more than 4 years of researching objects and images in the museum collection and beyond. Vicky is an expert in Renaissance bronze sculpture, and I'm an early modern cultural historian of Italy. Together, through the display and interpretation of more than 200 objects, we told a story about food within the history of production, consumption in Europe and across the globe, and also about food's contribution to the creation of religious and political identities in the early modern period. I should say that, and needless to say, that of course the exhibition was not possible without the skills and the contribution of the Fitzwilliam Museum exhibition team. Separate from the fact that I don't actually look too bad in this photograph, which is unusual, I'm showing it because you can see the recreation of a Baroque feasting table circa 1650, which was conceived and made by the incredible food historian Ivan Day, to whom the exhibition catalogue was in fact dedicated. In fact, if you don't know Ivan's work, I suggest that you take a look online. Behind the table, there's a studio copy of a painting by Franz Schneiders of a fowl market from after 1621. Vicky's placement of the table and the painting within the same sight line, because that was her job, in the exhibition was deliberate, as was the display of the Joris van Son painting nearby, for both paintings inspired Ivan Day's recreation of this table, what would have been considered the very height of luxury in the early modern period. Feasting, as this table shows, is an art. It requires and required access to not only abundance of food, but also rare and refined foods, which were then transformed by the skill and labor of many hands into artful objects. In this case, intricate meat pies, which were formed in pastry, filled with food, and then gilded and topped with the decorated and stuffed carcasses of these dead birds. Before I go further in my analysis, it's worth making a disclaimer that none of these animals were killed for the exhibition display. They died as a result of an accident in the case of the swan. The partridge and pheasant were roadkill, And the peacock had actually been farmed and killed for its meat. And then they were given to the taxidermist. The fine glassware from Venice, the gilded standing cup and cover from the Netherlands, and the ivory-handled knives from Germany all signified wealth to the diners at this 17th century table. One also has to imagine the flickering candlelight playing against a reflection in the glass and against the metallic surfaces, which would have added to a kind of sensual luxuriousness of this recreated dining event. The smell of the candles themselves, made from more expensive beeswax rather than cheaper animal fat, would also have signified to the guest that the host had not skimped on costs. Yet the host's wealth was not represented simply in the smell of the candles, nor the weight and the expense of the gold and silver used to make these objects, and nor even in the artistry of the goldsmiths and silversmiths commanded to make them. This food art, created by early modern pastry chefs, also signified wealth and prestige to the invited guests at this feasting table. The value of this food lay in the labor, equipment, and knowledge required to make the pies. Princely kitchens were therefore centers of knowledge, skill, and equipment used to enhance the power of princely hosts through the making of food for display and consumption. This print of a pastry maker's shop reveals some of these secrets. You can see the apprentices on the very left rolling out pastry beside a large basket of eggs. There's game hanging above their head, and there are molds to make cakes hanging from the top of the ledge of the print, with the finished pies displayed at the front. The master pastry maker at the back places a pie in the burning oven, a reminder of the amount and cost of fuel which was required to bake the pies and which few could afford to do in their own homes. All of this skill, cost, and labor lay behind these table displays. Printed books, such as Bartolomeo Scapi's opera, included images of these kitchen spaces, so that's the book on the right. Kitchen spaces and equipment, including these pastry jaggers, and these books made these secrets available to a much wider reading public outside of the princely kitchen, or in this case, the papal kitchen, which is where Scapi worked. The pastry jaggers are the kinds of objects which rarely survive into the modern period. They were not collected by museums, and those which do survive have been collected by private collectors for their unusual shape or decoration, rather than as part of a larger story about the functioning of the kitchens or how apprentices were trained as pastry cooks. In a previous lecture, Alex Rushmore noted the commercialization of elite dining in restaurants in the 18th and 19th century. And this is a slightly earlier story. In these pastry shops, in fact, provided princely homes with some of these pies. And so you actually didn't need to have the labor or the kind of kitchen necessary to make a pie. So it's a kind of commercialization of these skills. Some of the work of the cultural historian, therefore, is to recover the knowledge and labor behind these displays in order to understand their value and meaning to contemporaries, from diners to makers. Another is to evoke bodily experience. However, this experience is hard to recover when so much that was on the table was ephemeral. What has survived in museum collections, our primary sources, are the costly glassware and gold and silver vessels, and they're often displayed in museums, out of context, behind cases in rows, according to form, material, or country of origin. Ivan Day's reconstructions take us closer to the early modern experience. Imagine this table with only the museum objects, just the Dutch and German standing cups at the center. But there was, in fact, much more on the table than what this photo shows. The sugar sculptures which transformed sugar into classical temples and gods. However, these objects were hard to reuse because they easily got marked up and because of their fragility, so they don't survive. What else? The music, lighting, and the noise and movement of servants as they orchestrated the dinner and moved around the diners. And the smells, of course. The sharp smell of the wax burning, the sickly smell of sugar warming near the candle wicks, the smells of human bodies wrapped in velvet, overlain by wafts of rosewater, lavender, and ambergris. As William Tullett's recent work on 18th century England shows, smell was as much a social sense as a bodily one. The cultural history of the senses can then tell us about attitudes to health, urban life, and of course, food. But in trying to evoke bodily experience, is this simply reenactment? Can we really get closer to early modern experience by reconstructing tables, reconstructing recipes, or clothes? Of course. Early music practitioners have been doing this for at least a century, combining the study of manuscripts with performance, but not without controversy. As there have been some questions about authenticity in relation to the instruments, even to the spaces in which the music is and was performed and heard. Cultural historians have started to turn to reconstruction or remaking as a historical method, and we have a lot to learn from experts like Ivan Day, who, although they often work outside of academia and with museums, use the same kinds of sources and often have a much deeper technical knowledge of objects and the process of making than historians like me, who were originally trained in the analysis of texts. Here, for example, is a page from a German compilation of an Italian carving book which included other table arts, such as napkin folding. Complex structures, such as the sailing vessel on the left in the text and the rampant lion and griffin at Waddesdon Manor in the photograph, were made by the folding of white linen napkins and placed on the table to contrast with the whiteness of the sugar sculptures and, in the 18th century, the whiteness of the white porcelain ornaments. Reconstructions of these napkin sculptures, such as those by the Catalan artist Joan Salas at Waddesdon Manor, help us recreate more fully the early modern elite dining experience. They also animate the study of the two-dimensional image on the page and help us understand better the process of making. In this way, our attention turns away from the seated diner, away from the prince who commissioned the work, and instead turns to the maker or artisan, broadening out our historical understanding of food. For cultural historians and their students, the results of reconstruction are less important than the understanding that is gained from doing the reconstruction. For example, the use of a simple combination of ice and salt to freeze a liquid to make ice cream demonstrates that this frozen dessert did not require expensive ingredients or a cold room and was eaten by a much broader spectrum of consumers before the 19th century, therefore challenging early chronologies of its consumption as a luxury. In another example, the difficulties of locating Seville oranges in May for the making of an 18th century marmalade recipe from a manuscript, as one of my students tried, reminds us of the extent to which makers in the early modern period worked necessarily within the seasons. Finally, the thickness of early modern hot chocolate, when remade, alerts us to its particular suitability for dipping biscuits. The shape and the feel of a mancerina or a chocolate cup also brings up questions about the consumption of this thick, hot liquid in relation to gender, sociability, comportment, and politeness. These three examples of the reconstruction of recipes from 18th century Naples, London, and Barcelona show the value of going beyond the text or even beyond what survives as objects in museums in order to write a fuller history of food. And in this way, we also recover histories of knowledge, labor, and the body. All of this feasting, however, did not go without comment. Already in the lecture series, you've heard of the environmental damage of eating meat today and the virtues of not eating meat. In the early modern period, eating meat also had a moral resonance. It was a key food ingredient in the system of the four humors and also the subject of debate about its health-giving properties in debates that were about sort of flesh or fish. And those debates from Antiquity through to this period. The overeating of any foodstuff, however, was not recommended, and criticism of excess was often depicted as eating too much meat. For example, these images of the fat kitchen, which is after Bruegel, where these German peasants shove meat into their mouths, sausages are hanging from the fireplace, and pigs are being roasted and lay roasted on the table. Meat, of course, signified power, as the copy of Snyder's Fowl Market might suggest, for power lay not only in the skill of transforming food into art, but also in the lands from which a whole range of game animals were cared for and hunted. Particular kinds of meat were recommended for elite constitution. Fowl over pigs, for example, because anything which was closer to the ground was associated with plebeian bodies. Meat also signified man's power over nature and the natural world, even if early modern satirists were able to joke about the possibility of the world turned upside down, in which the hunter becomes the hunted, as in the 16th century print. So you can see the hunter in the middle of the print with the hares turning the spit. It wasn't really until the end of the 17th century when one can identify more clearly contemporary criticism of the treatment of animals, not only those animals which were hunted, but also those which were raised for dairy production. And that appears in the works of the Anabaptist Thomas Tryon. Of course, not eating meat at certain times of the year was a requirement for all Christians, a form of partial fasting. It was an act of denial, an act of faith, and was embedded in the religious calendar. Estimates vary, but most Christians were meant to avoid meat and sometimes also dairy and eggs for up to 166 days of the year, which makes up more than 40% of the calendar. This included the 40-day Lenten period in the run-up to Easter, as well as Fridays throughout the year and the eves of major holidays such as Saints' Days and Christmas. For some Christians, not eating meat on Wednesdays and Saturdays was also expected. In its strictest sense, this, what's called the thin diet, rather than the fast diet, during the rest of the year, the fast diet was the rest of the year, was a vegan diet with no animal products. So that's in the strictest sense. However, variations developed because of the limits of what was available in different regions of Europe, and also according to different interpretations of the Christian tradition. At its most generous, the fasting diet included the eating of fish. In fact, the vestige of this is still that in most schools across Europe, fish is served on a Friday. Following a thin diet in a city on the Mediterranean, such as Naples, was a lot easier, where oil for cooking and fish were plentiful, than a city in the Alps, such as Geneva, where the diet consisted of a lot of butter and cheese. Unlike for feasting, there are very few objects which have survived associated with this fasting tradition. This makes sense, of course, because it's the material culture of denial rather than the material culture of excess and abundance. This simple ceramic pipkin from Harlow, on which the words read, "Fast and pray, 1670, are inscribed, must have been used on fasting days to warm a vegetable dish or a simple broth. Its bottom is burnished, its handle is missing, and it's very unlike the beautiful and expensive objects from the Fitzwilliam Museum on the Baroque feasting table. In fact, this is, I think, possibly Vicky's least favorite object, and it only ended up at the Fitzwilliam because of the collecting interests of the Trinity mathematician James Glaisher, who was particularly keen, you could even say obsessed, on buying named and dated early modern English ceramics, even if they were broken. So this is a really unusual survival, and it's an unusual survival in a decorative arts museum. What has survived is the rich and complex culinary traditions associated with this thin diet, recorded in cookery books. Representations of Lent often included the foodstuff linked with this diet. So here you see an etching by actually one of my favorite artists from Bologna, Giuseppe Maria Mitelli. And you can see, so this is a female personification of Lent. On the left-hand side, you can see a skate going up. On the very far right-hand side, you can see a cardoon, fish again, hanging from there. And then you keep going down, there's onions and garlic, and then there's some snails at the very bottom as well. So she's surrounded by vegetables, fish, and snails. And she's also got that braided string of garlic in her hands. This elongated and melancholy image does not match the variety and ingenuity of the culinary tradition around Lent and fasting days, which surprisingly included a feasting tradition within it. No images of these feasts survive, but the Neapolitan Antonio Latini, in his cookery book of 1694, Lo Scalco alla Moderna, or The Modern Steward, described a series of lean feasts catered by him, including the menus. And here's the description of one of these lean feasts held during Lent. Lunch, made in Pozzuoli, hosted by His Excellency Prince of Firoleto for Prince Giovan Pico, his brother-in-law, who took him there to see the many curiosities seen by gentlemen who come to this noble city of Partenope, which is another word for Naples, with the participation of 4 other gentlemen served at the table on a lean day, giorno di magro, in the first days of April. The feast comprised a cold course served from the credenza, or sideboard, which included a fish pie in the shape of a ship, and then 10 warm courses made up of 3 to 6 dishes, including slices of tuna belly salami, which was used to replace a normal pork salami during Lent, a macaroni dish covered in a mixture of breadcrumbs and almond milk and baked in pine nut milk. So here's an attempt to use this non-dairy alternative in the 17th century. And cutlets made out of the pulp of swordfish stuffed with prunes, pine nuts, raisins, and truffles, followed by 1 cold course again from the credenza, which included pears, apples, mandarins, grapes, green almonds, raw peas, broad beans, and fennel, along with cold cooked cardoons and artichokes. Latini writes at the end of this long menu, "The conversation finished, we returned to the city, each one satisfied by the beautiful curiosities seen in this ancient city, with no mention of the food." While the purpose of this princely visit was to see some of the Roman ruins at Fitzwilliam on the Bay of Naples, this extraordinary feast was an important opportunity for one prince to host another while observing Lent, and that was very important, but also for Latini to flaunt his culinary skills. One of the primary skills of artisans in the Baroque period was the ability to dissimulate and create wonder, to make plaster look like marble, glass to look like precious gems, sugar to look like porcelain, and even folded linen napkins to become griffins. The elite dining table was the perfect place for this kind of dissimulation for stewards like Latini, and the Lenten feast was a particular challenge because feasting in early modern Europe, as you've seen, involved copious amounts of meat. At the heart of this Lenten feasting tradition was the ability to create dishes which looked like meat but were made of fish or vegetables, and in this way astounding the diners with these feats of dissimulation, a long-standing strategy even within modern vegetarianism, if you think of vegan bacon, for instance. Food historians tell us that from the Renaissance, the revival of the study of ancient texts brought a new interest in a diet based on vegetables, what was known as the Pythagorean Diet. Of course, this was an elite phenomenon influenced by humanism in Europe and later strengthened by the growing knowledge of vegetarian diets in other parts of the world, such as South Asia. John Evelyn's interest in vegetables stems from that context, but it also developed alongside a growing horticultural interest, as Evelyn and his contemporaries, such as Samuel Pepys, became obsessed with vegetables and salads, and with lettuce in particular. Although Evelyn was keen to promote the health benefits of eating a vegetable-based diet in his 1699 book, Ascetaria, a discourse on salads, many historians have also noted that this work fits into a growing interest in lighter, delicate, and less seasoned dishes, partly influenced by French cooking, in which the vegetable itself could be tasted. And yet also included in the book are recipes from the Lenten culinary tradition, which I've just described, plain and well-known dishes which were eaten in Britain and Europe during Lent or on fasting days, and easily found in late medieval manuscripts. Tansy, for instance, was a pudding or omelette made with the tansy flour, which had very particular digestive qualities, let's say, for what Evelyn calls potage maigre, is really a plain, ordinary vegetable soup. In histories of vegetarianism, there's so much focus on the changing taste of fashionable elites that we forget that most people in this period were eating greens of one kind or another, sometimes foraged as wild food if they lived close enough to a field or forest, or food grown in urban gardens. The historical evidence around feasting creates this historiographical focus on food, on meat, and this means that the ordinary vegetable and ordinary vegetable eater gets lost in the narrative. Vincenzo Corrado was one of the best-selling writers of 18th century Naples, and his cookery book, Del Cibo Pitagorico, on the Pythagorean or herbaceous food of 1781, included recipes for a whole range of vegetables listed here in the table of contents on the right. Lettuce, spinach, green cabbage, pumpkins, long pumpkin, winter squash, cauliflower, fennel, endive, cardoon, kohlrabi, artichokes, broccoli, borage, mustard greens, onion, kale, turnips, chicory, aubergines, carrots. The list goes on. The subtitle of Corrado's book is For the Use of Nobles and the Lettered. And this pitch to elite readers, and the reference to Pythagoras easily place the book within this historical narrative about the fashionability of vegetables for elite diners. But there are some clues that this is not the whole story. The recipes are fairly simple, certainly far from Latini's creations, and sometimes the Neapolitan word is used for well-known vegetables grown outside of the city and eaten within it, such as the word pastanaga for carrots, which likely derives from Catalan under the Aragonese period. In fact, the people of Naples, before they became known as mangia macaroni, so the eaters of macaroni in the late 18th century, for what was understood as their sort of prodigious consumption of pasta, they were actually known before that as mangiafoglie, or leaf eaters. Corrado's list of vegetables suggests the continuity and richness of that vegetable eating tradition across the social spectrum. If there were British readers of Corrado's book, and it was actually dedicated to an English aristocrat, they would not have been surprised about the Neapolitan fondness for vegetables, because for many Protestant readers, the eating of vegetables was definitively associated with Catholicism and the Lenten diet. The popular trope of the roast beef eating Briton in the 18th century drew from a confessional stereotype which associated fast-breaking Protestants with meat eating from the 16th century. As Lyndall Roper has shown, Luther's image as the married, stout doctor offered an alternative model of piety to the self-denying and emaciated Catholic priest. The strength of this association lived on in anti-French caricatures of the late 18th century, such as this one by James Gilray of 1792. The French sans-culotte is munching on what looks like garlic greens or maybe leeks, with snails coming out of the pot. You can see there in the background. These are all foodstuffs associated with the Lenten diet. Food came to be associated with national identities, but the question remains whether these food identities had any meaning. And on the right-hand side, of course, is the roast beef eating Briton. Now I turn to Thomas Jones, mentioned in the master's introduction. Jones was the son of a Welsh landowner, the second son, who trained as a landscape painter in London. He spent most of his 30s living in Rome and then in Naples to continue his training to make a living as an artist. Although he wasn't particularly successful in his own lifetime, his paintings were increasingly admired from the 1950s and are now well known in many national collections. From May 1780 to August 1783, Jones lived in Naples with his common-law Danish wife, Maria, and where his two daughters were born. His first house was likely to have been facing this building here, which he painted from his kitchen window in 1782. I'll show you some other paintings as well because they're so beautiful. This is from the National Gallery, and this one is the National Museum of Wales and Cardiff. Separate from these paintings, his time in Naples is recorded in two sources. His memoirs, which were rewritten from a diary that he kept at the time, and then the diary is now lost. And unusually, his household accounts, which record almost every purchase that he made for his family over 3 years. And here's the account book, or at least how it looks in the archive. And there's the first page, which indicates that he bought the book when he first arrived in Italy in 1766, but he actually didn't use it regularly right away. He occasionally used it as a sketchbook, so there's some sketches at the back. There's some recipes for shoe polish and stew, and some other household remedies, as well as a currency and weight conversion chart. But most of the pages are taken up by the accounts. And here you can see some of the one of the account book pages. This is when he first arrived. As he set up his household, you can see him buying furniture, kitchen equipment, gets his hair done, and also food supplies, flour, for instance. He also records, I think, rather evocatively, it's in a different ink, so it's probably written at a different time, that he slept in the house for the first time Monday, 29th of May at 1780. He writes, "Lay for the first night at my new lodgings." And here in another page of the account book, he records purchases over 3 days in September 1780, a Monday, a Tuesday, and a Wednesday. On Monday, he bought oil, eggs, paid the barber, and bought about 800 grams of macaroni. It's not clear how big a rotolo is. There's lots of disagreement, but it's a term used for both weight and volume in southern Italy, really from the Middle Ages. On Tuesday, he bought some meat for stewing, more eggs, paid the washerwoman, bought some watermelon, and sent off a letter. On Wednesday, he bought more meat, bread, erbette, which could be either leaves, like wild dandelion leaves, or fresh herbs, sugar, and lemons, which he actually wrote in English, if you can see on the account. It's really interesting because the first maybe couple weeks are in English, and after that they're entirely in Italian. These accounts, known as his Italian accounts book, have never been published and is one of the key sources of my cultural history of Naples. They can tell us a lot about networks of food production, consumption patterns, food prices, the service industry, and transport across the city. However, recent research on account books has encouraged historians to study household accounts as ego documents or life writing. So you could sort of say that this household account is a kind of food diary. Having the memoirs makes it easier, so I can match up descriptions of dinners with friends with special purchases that he makes in the accounts, as in this case, this dinner in 1781, in July 1781, where he went on a boat with these men, and then they came off, had dinner at his house, and they went back on the boat again. However, I'm more interested in his day-to-day purchases, the rhythms of food purchased over the day, from morning to evening, over the week, from Monday to Friday, and over the seasons, from spring to summer to autumn. Here's where we can also find more meaning in the food choices that he made for himself and his family. Jones did buy a lot of meat. Almost all of it were cuts for stewing, as he didn't have the facilities to roast meat. Jones also bought a lot of vegetables: carrots, cabbage, onions, peppers, aubergine, cauliflower leeks, spinach, cucumbers, tomatoes, peas, radishes, and a lot of salad. The kinds of vegetables listed in Corrado's cookery book. He sometimes recorded the names of the vegetables using Neapolitan names or in Italian with a Neapolitan pronunciation. And this way you can actually hear his oral world. You can hear the voices of the people who sold him the vegetables in the market. He also bought a lot of different kinds of fish, lots of olive oil, and lots of eggs. And judging by his purchases on Thursday evening and Friday morning markets and through Lent, he and his family seem to be following the thin diet as prescribed. But there's more in the detail than what we can find in just in patterns. Here, this is one of my favorite entries. You can see his joy of finding the first peas of the season in late April 1782. Peas, he writes for the first time, 3 bunches. What is clear that Jones was entirely acculturated to the culinary calendar of Naples, eating like an ordinary Neapolitan every day, despite the concerns of British contemporaries about the emasculating effects of living in Italy for too long and eating Italian food. And that's indicated here in these elongated macaroni figures of the 1770s. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see the carrots in the background behind the French cook with his saucepan in hand. The macaroni figure, in fact, extended existing Protestant stereotypes around the moral and physical effects of the Catholic Lenten diet. There is so much more that I could say about Jones and his accounts. They are truly an extraordinary source and a gift to me as a cultural historian, but we're also running out of time. It's worth pointing out that so much information can also distort our interpretation historians, so lots of information is not necessarily all good information. These accounts are an unusual survival, but they only record the purchases of one Welsh artist with his Danish wife and his 2 small girls in the 1780s in Naples. His wife and children hardly appear in the accounts. Sometimes you can see him buying medicine when the girls are sick, or he's giving money to Maria, his wife. The labor behind the process of transforming the food that he's buying on the streets into food at the table is barely visible. You can really not see it. But one can see sometimes payments to various servants, Mariella, for instance, who must have prepared and cooked the vegetables, meat, and fish for the family with their hands, with their skills, and their knowledge. And although we have an image of his first kitchen, none of the material culture of Jones's household in Naples survives, which is recorded in his accounts. Which is recorded in his accounts survives. So he is buying a lot of kind of kitchen equipment, but none of it survives. And this is really not surprising, since these kinds of ordinary objects, pots, pans, dishes, are usually thrown out if they're no longer useful and if they have no sentimental value. Nor do we have any cookery books. That's a bit sad. Not even one of Vincenzo Currado's cookery books, which was actually published in the time that he was living in Naples. So there are also many absences in this story with which we have to work as cultural historians. Jones and his family returned to London in August 1782 and then to Wales to take over his father's estate after the death of his brother. Here is a portrait of them in 1797, 6 years before Jones' death in 1803. The girls are grown up. Maria is a model of domestic propriety, and Jones is quite a lot plumper than he was in 1776. There are no household accounts for any of these years in Wales, so we have no idea what they ate every day after their return. Jones did record in one of the last entries in the Italian accounts book that he and his family ate a meal of beef steaks, garden stuff, and English beer before they disembarked at Stangate Creek in Kent. So he actually ate some roast beef, some beef, as soon as he got into England. That's it. After that point, his life as an eater is entirely silent. We do know that many British Grand Tourists on returning from Italy recreated Italian meals among friends from the Grand Tour. And there were in fact grocery shops in London which sold Parmesan and other Italian delicacies, so it's testimony to that fashion. Parmesan was a fashionable foodstuff for London elites, but not what Jones would have eaten in Naples. There is no indication that he ate Parmesan. He ate all kinds of cheese, but it wasn't Parmesan. Maybe he tried to grow some of the vegetables and herbs in the kitchen garden on his estate in Wales. Maybe he succumbed to the pleasures of Welsh cooking. Literally, we don't know. Of course, what he ate was determined by what he could access. 18th century Naples was particularly well provisioned with fresh food, and Jones's diet reflects this, a reminder that food choice is determined by accessibility. Food deserts, as we now know them, exist in urban contexts today, where fresh food is not easily accessible by public transport. As Sarah McCarreggi, another lecturer in the series, has reminded us, food and its production and consumption can be political. This is just an image by Pietro Fabris of an area near the port, and these kinds of images are very typical for Grand Tours to buy in the 18th century. So Naples was very much associated with a kind of well-provisioned city, but in fact, my research shows it was very well-provisioned. There are lots and lots of fruit and vegetables. You can see that also in Thomas Jones' accounts. Before I finish, I want to share a poem with you, which was written by Jones in 1780, so he's still in Rome, before he went to Naples. And it was published anonymously in 1797, when he'd been in Wales for more than 10 years. I won't read it all, but I will read a few of the verses. It's in the voice of Grasso, so the figure associated with carnival, the fat diet, eating meat, okay, in Catholic culture. And Jones writes, so this is the central section. Your bacala and tunny are sickening to the thought, and so for love or money, let something else be bought. Bring me beefsteaks and oysters with gravy in the meat. Send these things to cloisters for Capuchins to eat. Your church with all its fasting has naught to do with me. A different mold I'm cast in, from all injunctions free. For doctor's dispensation or for the priest's consent, I've not the least occasion. What, though it should be Lent? This poem was published with the memoirs in 1948, and it certainly surprised me when I first read it. No one's really kind of put the two together. I'm not quite sure why. Well, obviously the person who edited the memoirs, but no one's kind of really looked at this poem. So what we see here is Jones peddling the stereotypes of the Catholic and Lenten eater, caricatured in 18th century print culture. It raises a number of questions about Jones's food identity, but also about our own food identities and how they are formed and how they change as we move between cities, join families, and live across borders. It also reminds us of how persistent food stereotypes linked to national identities can be, despite our lived experience, and also their power in political debates. Some of you might know of the Middle East's hummus wars, and what is the difference between Turkish and Greek coffee? Last night I spent some time researching cabbage roll recipes. How different are the Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish versions? The differences are small, but their meanings can be manipulated. Therefore, we need to recognize that food identities are not just personal or family identities, and that food identities and even food history can be moralized and mobilized in political ways. I guess to reverse this, to see it another way, does eating food from around the world bring tolerance, knowledge, and understanding of those worlds? Probably not. So as cultural history shows, representation does not always match practice, and therefore we're not always what we eat. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Melissa, for a really fascinating and thought-provoking exploration of the relationships between food and culture in early modern Europe, and indeed, I think, lessons for beyond Europe. I was particularly struck that you shared with us the challenges of just how difficult it is to understand what and how everyday eaters ate, and what they actually, and what that tells us about how they live their lives, their culture, their relationships, and their identities. Perhaps you also demonstrated the importance of keeping accounts, something I've never believed in until now, so thank you. It was Alex last week who, of course, said, we are what we eat, and today you've absolutely reminded us that we're not always what we eat, as you just said. So thank you very much. That was tremendous. Please join me in thanking Melissa again. Just to remind you that next week we go back further in time with Professor Martin Jones speaking about archaeology and discovering the food of the past. Join us again then. Thank you.
Thank you.